I never imagined my life would turn out this way. Art had always been my escape, a world where rules and boundaries melted away into streaks of color and emotion. But nothing could have prepared me for the storm that was about to disrupt the carefully drawn lines of my world, or the man at the center of it all. It began the evening my mom left for another work trip, her suitcase wheeled down the hall like a countdown timer. As the door clicked shut, Andy and I were left in the quiet, cavernous house. Andy. My stepfather. The word had always felt strange on my tongue. He'd been in my life for over a decade, ever since he married my mom, but he was never just some distant figure in the background. He was warm, thoughtful, patient. He'd been there for my art shows, for my heartbreaks, for every little crack and fissure in my life. In some ways, I'd always felt closer to him than I did to my own mother. But now, things were changing, shifting beneath the surface. That night, I was sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, sketchbook in hand, surrounded by scattered pencils and eraser shavings. Andy had just returned from work, his tie loosened, shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing strong, veined forearms. "Still at it?" he asked, dropping his keys onto the counter. "Always," I said, smiling up at him. He leaned over my sketchbook, his brow furrowing slightly as he studied my latest attempt, a swirling mess of abstract shapes that I wasn't sure made sense even to me. "It's good," he said. "But, what's it about?" I hesitated. "I don't know yet. It's complicated." He sat down across from me, knees brushing mine. "Sometimes you just have to let it be complicated. Let the meaning find you." It was such a simple thing to say, but it hit me like a revelation. I looked up at him, and for the first time, I noticed the way his hair caught the warm light from the lamp, the faint lines at the corners of his eyes that deepened when he smiled. There was something grounding about his presence, something I'd always taken for granted. Until now. We talked for hours that night, about art, architecture, dreams, regrets. His voice was steady, calming, and I found myself opening up to him in ways I never had before. I told him about my fears, that I'd never be good enough, that my art would never mean anything to anyone but me. And he told me about his own struggles, about the divorce, the guilt he carried for not being able to make it work. By the time I realized how late it was, the clock was ticking past midnight. I stood up to stretch, and Andy did the same. "Thanks for listening," I said, my voice soft. He smiled, a quiet, genuine smile that made something inside me tighten. "Anytime, Evie. You know that." And then it happened. I don't know if it was the late hour, the weight of everything we'd shared, or something else entirely. But when he hugged me goodnight, it lingered. His arms were strong around me, his warmth enveloping me, and I didn't want to let go. For a moment, the world felt smaller, quieter, like it was just the two of us in it. When we finally pulled back, our eyes met. It was brief, just a flicker, but it was there, something unspoken passing between us, a spark I couldn't ignore. My heart raced, confusion swirling through me like a storm. "Good night, Evie," he said, his voice lower than usual. "Good night," I whispered, barely able to meet his gaze. I lay awake for hours that night, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that it was nothing. Just a moment of vulnerability, of human connection. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. Something had shifted, and there was no going back. By morning, we both pretended nothing had happened. He greeted me with his usual warmth, and I responded in kind. But every glance, every touch felt different now, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. The spark had been lit, and I was terrified of where it might lead. They say you can't unsee something once it's burned into your mind. That's how it felt waking up the morning after our hug, the kind of hug that didn't belong in the neat confines of family. It was as though Andy's touch had left fingerprints on my thoughts, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't wipe them away. He was sitting at the kitchen table when I came downstairs, sipping coffee, a blueprint spread out in front of him. He looked so normal, so casual, like nothing had happened. For a moment, I wondered if I'd imagined the entire thing. But then he glanced up, his eyes meeting mine, and there it was again, the flicker, the spark, that unspoken current between us. "Morning," he said, his voice even. "Morning," I replied, my voice a little too bright, a little too forced. The day passed in a haze. I tried to focus on my art, on the swirl of shapes and colors on my canvas, but my mind kept drifting. I thought about the way Andy's voice sounded when he said my name, the way his smile felt like it was just for me. It was wrong, I knew that, but the wrongness only made it more magnetic. That evening, when Mom called to check in, I could barely focus on her words. She talked about her meetings, her coworkers, the weather in some far-off city. I nodded and murmured responses, all the while hyper-aware of Andy sitting across the room, his attention fixed on his laptop. Every so often, I caught him glancing at me, and each glance felt like a secret whispered across the space between us. By the time Mom hung up, I was a mess of nerves. I needed air, an escape from the suffocating tension. Grabbing my jacket, I muttered something about going for a walk. "Wait," Andy said, standing. "I'll come with you." The night was cool, the air crisp and clean. We walked in silence at first, the only sound the crunch of leaves beneath our feet. I could feel the weight of his presence beside me, a gravity that pulled at me even as I tried to resist. "Are you okay?" he asked after a while, his voice low and gentle. I hesitated. "Yeah. I think so. You've seemed distracted today." I laughed nervously. "You've noticed?" "I notice a lot of things," he said, and there was something in his tone, something that made my breath hitch. We stopped by a small park, the swings and slides bathed in the glow of a nearby street lamp. I sat down on one of the swings, wrapping my arms around the chains, and Andy leaned against the frame, watching me. "You can talk to me, Evie," he said. "About anything." I looked up at him, my heart pounding. For a moment, I thought about telling him the truth, about laying everything bare. But the words caught in my throat, tangled up in fear and confusion. Instead, I said, "Sometimes I feel like I'm not good enough. Like I'm just wasting my time." His expression softened. "You're not wasting your time. You're talented, Evie. And more than that, you have something that most people don't." "What's that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Heart," he said simply. The way he said it, the way he looked at me, made my chest tighten. I wanted to believe him, to let his words wash over me and take away all my doubts. But it wasn't just his words that lingered, it was the way he lingered, the way his gaze held mine a little too long, a little too intensely. We walked back to the house in silence, the tension between us thick and undeniable. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying every glance, every word, every moment. The spark was no longer a flicker. It was a flame, small but steady, and I was powerless to extinguish it. The days that followed were a blur of stolen moments and unspoken truths. Andy started texting me little things, a joke about something he saw on a site visit, a picture of a building he thought I'd like. Each message felt like a thread, weaving a web that pulled us closer together. And then there were the looks. Across the room, at the dinner table, in the car. His eyes would meet mine, and in that split second, the world would fall away. It was like we had our own secret language, one that didn't need words. One afternoon, he asked if I wanted to see one of the houses he was designing. "I could use your artistic eye," he said, his tone casual, but his eyes told a different story. I agreed, my heart pounding in my chest. We drove out to the site, a half-finished house perched on the edge of a quiet street. Inside, it was empty, the walls bare, the floors unfinished. But it felt alive, filled with possibilities. "What do you think?" he asked, standing close enough that I could feel the warmth of him. "It's beautiful," I said, my voice unsteady. "So are you," he said, so quietly I almost didn't hear it. I turned to him, my breath catching in my throat. For a moment, neither of us moved. The air between us was electric, charged with all the things we weren't saying. And then, just as quickly, he stepped back, breaking the spell. "We should get going," he said, his voice tight. But as we drove home, the silence between us spoke louder than any words ever could. Something was building, something we couldn't ignore. And deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before it consumed us both. I never thought silence could be so loud. It followed us everywhere, a constant, unspoken presence in the room, in the car, in every glance we shared. Andy and I were walking a tightrope, balancing between what was right and what we couldn't stop feeling, and the tension was becoming unbearable. It started with the texts. Innocent at first, or at least that's what I told myself. A picture of a design sketch. A message about a building he thought I'd find interesting. And then there were the late-night questions. Are you still awake? What's on your mind? I'd answer every time, heart racing, pretending that these exchanges were nothing more than friendly conversations. But we both knew better. One evening, he texted me, "Want to come see the new site tomorrow? I think you'll love the layout." I stared at the message, debating. Every time we were alone together, the air between us felt heavier, like it was pressing down on the boundaries we were supposed to uphold. But the pull was stronger than my fear. I replied with a single word, "Sure." The next day, we drove to the site, a house half hidden by trees at the edge of a quiet cul-de-sac. The construction crew had left for the day, leaving the place eerily still. Andy unlocked the door, holding it open for me as I stepped inside. The space was bare, the walls skeletal beams, the floors rough plywood, but there was a kind of beauty in its incompleteness. "What do you think?" he asked, standing close behind me. "It's incredible," I said, turning to face him. "You're really talented, you know that?" He smiled, a little self-conscious. "Coming from you, that means a lot." We wandered through the house, our voices low, our footsteps echoing in the empty rooms. He showed me where the windows would go, how the light would spill across the floors, and as he spoke, I found myself watching him more than the space. The way his hands moved as he explained his vision. The way his voice softened when he asked my opinion. The way he stood just a little too close, like he couldn't help it. In the living room, he paused, looking out at the overgrown backyard. "Sometimes I think about what it'd be like to live in a place like this. Quiet. Peaceful. Away from everything." "Everything?" I asked, stepping closer. He glanced at me, and for a moment, the vulnerability in his eyes made my breath catch. "Yeah. You know, the noise. The expectations. The rules." His words hung in the air, and I felt something shift between us, like the ground was giving way beneath our feet. Without thinking, I reached out, my fingers brushing his arm. He didn't pull away. Instead, he turned toward me, his gaze locking onto mine. "Evie," he began, his voice low, almost a warning. I stepped back, breaking the spell. "We should go," I said quickly, my voice trembling. He nodded, but neither of us moved. The silence between us was thick, suffocating. Finally, he turned, leading the way back to the car. The ride home was quiet, but it wasn't the comfortable silence we used to share. It was charged, heavy with everything we weren't saying. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of him standing in that unfinished house, his eyes filled with something I couldn't name, wouldn't leave my mind. I wanted to text him, to say something, anything, but I didn't trust myself. Instead, I lay there, staring at my phone, waiting for a message that never came. The next morning, he was gone before I came downstairs, a note on the counter saying he'd be out all day. I spent the hours pacing, trying to focus on my art, but the lines on my canvas blurred into chaos. By the time he came home, I'd convinced myself that whatever was happening between us had to stop. But then he walked in, his hair tousled, his shirt slightly rumpled, and all my resolve crumbled. He smiled at me, just a small, fleeting smile, but it was enough to set my heart racing. "Hey," he said. "Busy day?" "Not really," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated, then said, "There's something I want to show you. If you're up for it." "What is it?" "You'll see," he said, his smile widening just a little. Before I knew it, We were in his car again, driving through the city. He didn't say where we were going, and I didn't ask. I trusted him, even though I knew I shouldn't. We ended up at another house, this one more finished, but still unoccupied. He unlocked the door, and we stepped inside. The space was warm, with soft light spilling through the windows, casting shadows on the walls. "What do you think?" he asked, his voice quiet. "It's beautiful," I said, my eyes roaming over the room. "It feels safe." He looked at me then, and I knew he felt it too. The pull. The inevitability. And for the first time I stopped fighting it. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, the air between us heavy with unspoken words. Then, slowly, he reached out, his fingers brushing mine. It was the smallest touch, but it sent a jolt through me, like lightning. "Evie," he said softly, his voice trembling. We can't." But his hand didn't move away, and neither did mine. We stood there, caught in the moment, the world outside fading into nothing. For the first time I didn't care about the consequences. I didn't care about anything but him. And in that stolen moment everything changed. The days after that moment at the house blurred together, a whirl of stolen glances and unspoken confessions. Every interaction felt like a test, a careful balance between the normalcy we had to project and the chaos simmering beneath the surface. I thought we were careful, but I was wrong. Mom's suspicion was subtle at first, questions that seemed innocent but carried an undertone of something sharper. "Where were you yesterday evening, Evie?" she asked over breakfast one morning, her eyes flicking between me and Andy. "I went to check out one of Andy's sites," I said, keeping my voice steady. Her brow furrowed. "Interesting. I don't remember him asking you for help with his projects before." Andy, ever calm under pressure, shrugged. "Evie's got a great eye for design. She's been helping me brainstorm a few ideas." Mom didn't look convinced, but she let it drop. "For now." That night, when Mom was out at a late meeting, Andy and I sat on opposite ends of the couch, the TV playing some forgettable show. The distance between us felt unbearable, an invisible wall we couldn't cross. "I think she knows," I said finally, breaking the silence. Andy turned to me, his expression unreadable. "We haven't done anything wrong," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Not yet," I whispered, the words hanging heavy in the air. He didn't reply, and I hated the tension that had crept into our once effortless connection. But even as the fear of discovery loomed over us, the pull between us only grew stronger. The next week, Andy and I fell into a pattern of subtle communication, a kind of code we developed to navigate the increasingly watchful eyes around us. A brush of the hand as he passed me a plate at dinner. A particular phrase slipped into casual conversation that meant "meet me later." It wasn't enough. Late one evening, while Mom was in the shower, I found Andy in his office. He was hunched over his laptop, the glow of the screen casting shadows across his face. "Hey," I said, stepping inside and closing the door softly behind me. He looked up, startled. "Evie, what are you?" "I couldn't sleep," I admitted, my heart pounding. "And I needed to see you." His expression softened, but there was still a tension in his shoulders. "We can't keep doing this," he said, though his voice lacked the conviction to make me believe him. I crossed the room, stopping just short of his desk. "Doing what, Andy?" "We're just talking." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. The air between us was charged, the space shrinking with every passing second. Before he could respond, the sound of the shower turning off echoed down the hall. We both froze, reality crashing back in. "You should go," he said quickly, his voice low. I nodded, but as I turned to leave, I caught his hand, squeezing it briefly. It was a silent promise, a reminder of the connection we couldn't escape. The next day, Mom confronted me. "I've noticed you've been spending a lot of time with Andy," she said, her tone carefully neutral. I forced a laugh. "He's been showing me his projects. You know how much I love architecture." Her eyes narrowed. "Just architecture?" The implication in her words made my stomach twist. What else would it be? I asked, keeping my voice light. She didn't answer, but the tension in the room was palpable. That evening, Andy and I met at one of his unfinished sites, a secluded place where we could breathe without the weight of watchful eyes. The house was almost complete, the walls painted, the floors polished. It felt like a sanctuary, a world apart from the chaos waiting for us at home. We can't keep meeting like this, Andy said, pacing the empty living room. She's starting to suspect. Then what do we do? I asked, my voice breaking. He stopped, turning to face me. We stop. We have to. The words hit me like a blow, but I could see the pain in his eyes, the way it mirrored my own. Do you really think we can? He didn't answer, and the silence was all the confirmation I needed. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the room, we stood there, caught in a web of our own making. The walls were closing in, and I didn't know how much longer we could hold them off. But even as the world threatened to unravel around us, I couldn't bring myself to let him go. Every step forward felt like stepping onto cracked ice, yet I couldn't stop moving toward him. Each meeting, each stolen glance, each moment away from prying eyes chipped away at the walls we tried to build. By the time the next evening came, I knew we had passed the point of no return. Mom had gone to bed early, her questions about Andy's schedule lingering like smoke in the air. I waited in my room, heart pounding, watching the clock until I got the signal. A single text, living room. Now. I crept downstairs, my bare feet silent on the wooden steps. Andy was sitting on the couch, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped tightly together. He looked up when he heard me, his eyes heavy with an emotion I couldn't quite name but felt in my chest like an ache. Evie, he said quietly, his voice rough. We need to talk. I nodded, crossing the room to sit beside him, closer than I probably should have. About what? He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. About this. Whatever this is. You know what it is, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. You feel it, too. He exhaled sharply, like he'd been holding his breath. That's the problem, Evie. I do feel it. And I can't. I shouldn't. His words hurt more than I expected, but I refused to let them deter me. Andy, stop pretending this is something we can ignore. We've tried, haven't we? It's not working. He looked at me then, and the raw honesty in his gaze made my heart skip. It's wrong. It's dangerous. And it'll ruin everything. I reached out, placing my hand over his. It already has. So what's the point in denying it? For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, slowly, his fingers curled around mine, his grip firm but trembling. Evie, his voice broke, and before I could stop myself, I leaned in. Our lips met softly at first, tentative and unsure, but the dam had burst. All the tension, the longing, the countless moments we'd spent holding back, came rushing out like a flood. His hands found my face, his touch both gentle and desperate, like he couldn't believe this was real. We pulled away after what felt like both an eternity and a split second, our breathing heavy, our foreheads pressed together. This changes everything, he said, his voice barely audible. I nodded, my fingers tracing the edge of his jaw. I don't care. But of course, the world wouldn't let us have our moment. The sound of footsteps on the stairs shattered the silence, and we sprang apart like guilty children caught in the act. Mom's voice cut through the darkness. What's going on down here? My heart stopped as she flipped the light switch, her eyes darting between us. Her expression shifted from confusion to something colder, sharper, as she took in the way we sat too far apart, too stiff, too guilty. Nothing, Andy said quickly, standing up. I couldn't sleep, and Evie came down to keep me company. Mom's eyes narrowed, her lips pressing into a thin line. Is that right? I nodded, forcing a casual smile. Yeah. We were just talking. She didn't say anything else, but the suspicion in her gaze was unmistakable. Without another word, she turned and went back upstairs, leaving us in a silence so thick it was suffocating. Andy ran a hand over his face, exhaling shakily. "This can't happen again, Evie. It's too risky." But his words felt hollow, even to him. We both knew it was a lie. The line had been crossed, and there was no going back. The next week was a blur of stolen moments and whispered conversations. We were careful, always watching, always waiting for the other shoe to drop. But the more we tried to pull away, the closer we were drawn together. It was inevitable. One night, Andy texted me again, "meet me at the house." My pulse quickened as I grabbed my jacket and slipped out of the house. The drive to the unfinished property felt like a dream, every turn bringing me closer to the only person who made me feel alive. When I arrived, he was already there, standing in the moonlit living room. He looked up as I entered, his expression unreadable. "I can't keep doing this," he said, his voice tight. "But I can't stay away from you either." I stepped closer, my heart pounding. "Then don't." And this time, there was no hesitation. The space between us disappeared as he pulled me into his arms, and the world outside faded into nothing. This was it. The point of no return. And I didn't care. But deep down, I knew the truth. We weren't just crossing lines anymore. We were erasing them entirely, and the fallout was only a matter of time. I thought the world had already fallen apart when Mom caught us that night, but I was wrong. The true destruction came the morning after, when she sat us both down at the kitchen table, her face a mask of cold fury. "I know what's going on," she said, her voice sharp and unforgiving. "And it stops now." Andy and I exchanged a glance, but neither of us spoke. What could we say? The air was thick with unspoken accusations and unrelenting tension. "I'm giving you one chance," she continued, her gaze piercing. "Whatever this thing is, it ends today. Or you both pack your things and get out of my house." Her words hit like a slap, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. She wasn't bluffing, I could see it in her eyes. This was an ultimatum, not a plea. "Mom, I began, but she cut me off with a raised hand. "No excuses, Evie. I trusted you. Both of you. And this, betrayal? It's unforgivable." Andy's jaw tightened, and he looked down at the table, his hands clenched into fists. "It wasn't intentional," he said quietly, his voice trembling. "It just happened." "Don't insult me with that nonsense," Mom snapped, her voice rising. "You're the adult here, Andy. You should have known better." The words hung in the air, cutting deeper than any blade. I wanted to defend him, to defend us, but what could I say? She wasn't entirely wrong. Andy should have walked away the moment things started to shift between us. But he didn't. And neither did I. "We'll stop," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "We'll end it. Just, please, don't do this." Mom's gaze softened for a moment, but only for a moment. "You have one chance," she repeated, standing up. "Don't make me regret it." She left the room, and the silence that followed was deafening. Andy and I sat there, not looking at each other, the weight of her words crushing us. "Maybe she's right," he said finally, his voice breaking. "Maybe this was a mistake." I looked at him, my heart shattering. "You don't mean that." "I don't know what I mean," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. "But we can't keep doing this, Evie. Not like this." The rest of the day passed in a haze. Andy left the house, saying he needed time to think, and I spent hours in my room, staring at the walls, trying to make sense of everything. My chest felt hollow, my thoughts a whirlwind of guilt, longing, and fear. By evening, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to see him, to talk to him, to figure out where we stood. I texted him, "Can we meet?" His reply came quickly, "The house. 1 hour." When I arrived, he was already there, standing in the empty living room, his shoulders slumped, his expression weary. He looked up when I walked in, and for a moment, we just stood there, staring at each other. "We need to talk," he said finally. "I know," I replied, my voice trembling. "Your mom, she's right," he said, his words cutting like knives. "This has to stop." Tears welled in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. "Andy, please. Don't do this. Don't let her decide for us." He shook his head, his expression torn. "It's not just about her, Evie. It's about us. About what this could do to you, to your future. I can't. I won't be the reason you lose everything." "You're everything," I said, my voice breaking. "Don't you get that?" He looked away, his jaw tightening. "I'm sorry." And just like that, it was over. I stood there, watching as he walked away, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the empty house. My chest felt like it was caving in, the weight of his absence suffocating me. For weeks, we avoided each other, the distance between us growing wider with each passing day. Mom seemed satisfied, her suspicions fading as time went on, but the tension in the house was unbearable. Every time I saw Andy, every time our eyes met across the room, it was like a wound being ripped open all over again. But some wounds don't heal. And some lines, once crossed, can never be redrawn. Andy left a few months later, taking a job in another city. I stayed behind, trying to rebuild my life, to piece together the fragments of who I used to be. But no matter how far he went, no matter how much time passed, he was always there, a shadow in my thoughts, a ghost in my heart. Because some loves, even the ones we're not supposed to have, never really go away.